banking. From the very beginning, banking in the United States has always been heavily regulated, most often regulated at the state level. The individual states regulated banking. But from the beginning, it was illegal for banks to operate across state lines. And many states prohibited banks from opening branches within their state. So if you were a bank, you had to have one office. And some states even prohibited banking in the early years in any form that we would recognize. And important for our story, the only way you could open a bank in the United States in those early years was to get a specific grant, a charter from the individual states. And those were often given out on the basis of political connections. You had to know the politician or the bureaucrat to be able to get one. So those early years in the United States clearly were not anything like a free enterprise system in banking. Those early years also in the United States saw the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States, the first from 1791 to 1811, then from 1816 to 1836. Those people sometimes think were central banks, but they really weren't. They were owned 1/5 by the government. They were more or less a bank for the government to use to do its business. But what's really important to understand is those first and second banks did not have any sort of monetary powers the way we think about central banks today. That all came to an end in 1836 when the second bank charter was not renewed. In the period from 1836 in the United States up until 1863, about the Civil War, is known as the free banking era. But that name is a real mistake, I think. What was true during that era is that some states began to allow banks to open without getting a politically granted charter. Basically, they set some rules and said, if you have this amount of capital and meet these other requirements, we'll automatically give you a charter. Michigan and New York, two states where I've lived most of my life, allowed any bank that meet those criteria to open up. And so a better name for this period would probably be called open entry in banking. Many other states adopted this, but it's important to understand that even though that banks could enter the banking industry very easily, there were still several areas of regulation, and I want to mention the three key ones. Banks could still had limits on how many branch offices they could open. They had requirements for how much reserves they had to hold and what kinds of reserves. So they had to hold a certain amount of gold or other kinds of things against their loans. And finally, if the banks wanted to issue currency, issue paper money, they had to purchase specific kinds of collateral against that. Sometimes they were state government bonds. In other cases, they had to purchase the bonds of the railroads. So the key point here is that these banks were still, even at the state level, heavily regulated. By 1863, though, a couple of things changed. Most importantly, the United States was involved in the Civil War, and the government, the federal government, the northern government, needed money to pay for the war. And so one of the things that they decided to do was to start to charter banks themselves. The federal government would offer charters to banks rather than just the individual states. The key here was that they applied the same three areas of regulation that the states did. In particular, what the federal government did was require federally chartered banks to buy U.S. government bonds to hold as collateral against the paper money they issued. Now, this is a good deal if you're the government, right? You've got these banks and you're requiring them, if they want to issue currency, to buy up your bonds, and by buying those bonds, in essence, pay for the Civil War. And this is an important point. Central banks throughout history, not just the Fed, but almost every central bank you can think of, was started as a way for governments to raise revenue, particularly for fighting wars. The history of the Bank of England, the history of several other central banks are wrapped up with the idea that by having a central bank, you could pay for activities of government. As I like to tell my students, if you could install a printing press in your basement and print up $20 bills to pay off your student loans or pay off your credit card debt, you do it, right? And that's in essence what the U.S. government was able to do in 1863. It also continued the same regulations about limits on branching, and it also had a set of regulations that had to do with reserve requirements and what banks could hold and different levels of banks, so that banks who were out in the countryside or were not in big cities had to hold reserves in banks that were in larger cities. And then the banks in the larger cities had to hold deposits or gold at banks in New York and then later in one other city as well. And so one of the things that this system did was it sort of created this pyramid or a domino effect that when the banks out in the country needed to get gold or needed to meet the needs of depositors, they had to pull their deposits out of the banks in the bigger cities, had to pull their deposits and their gold out of New York. And this sort of caused a ripple effect that was a real problem. And in fact, the result of these regulations in the United States were a series of financial panics in the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly in 1893 and 1907. Those two panics were severe. They were characterized by a shortage of currency, and eventually both of them led to significant recession. And they were often tied up with other issues in the economy, problems with the railroads or problems with the banking system. But one of the important things, two important things to recognize, these panics and these crises show us two things. One, you don't need a central bank to get problems in the banking system and in the financial system. Other forms of government intervention can do that. Sometimes people say, well, look, the United States had all these financial panics before they had a central bank, so maybe central banks aren't so terrible. But the thing to understand, it's true there was no central bank, but you had the federal government regulating banking in a variety of ways. For example, the big problem was that when people needed more currency, needed more paper money, they would go to their banks to try to get it. But the only way the banks could provide it is if they had enough of those government bonds in their possession to be able to serve as collateral. And everybody wants currency, and all the banks are trying to buy those government bonds. The price of those bonds would get bid up, and it became very difficult to find them. It took sometimes 6 or 8 weeks to get them approved through the government. People needed currency right then, especially during the harvest season in the fall, this time of year, and the banks could not provide it, even those regulations that were in place. So the U.S. system by the beginning of the 20th century was really a problem in many ways. And again, the comparison to Canada is instructive here. The Canadian banking system, just across the border, allowed their banks to operate anywhere across the country they wanted. They allowed their banks to hold any kind of assets they wanted to back up their currency. They didn't have to buy specific government bonds. And the reserve requirements in Canada were structured much better. They were smaller and sort of more sensibly constructed. The Canadian banks in the 1800s and early 1900s did not have those financial crises. It was one of the better banking systems in the world. And I would argue mostly because it was much closer to the kind of free, unregulated system that we want to talk about today. So what happened in the States in the early 20th century was a big debate on how to fix this system. And the problem was that the solutions that would have worked economically were difficult to implement politically. And we can talk about this later on, too, when we talk about moving to free banking. As I noted before, governments have a real interest in having a central bank. And proposals that take power out of the government's hands don't always sit very well. And so a number of proposals in the early 20th century before the Fed was created were ones that would have made the U.S. system look a lot like Canada, would have worked very well. The problem was that the banks in New York City didn't want to give up some of the power they had in the existing system. And bankers and politicians from the rest of the country were afraid that if we had free banking and free competition, the New York banks would take over the system. They would monopolize the system. So the politicians in those areas were able to block what would have been the good reforms. The result was a political compromise, and that political compromise was the Federal Reserve System. Important to understand here, too, the Federal Reserve System and really most central banks were not created sort of by economists deciding what's the best kind of banking system we should have. They were the products of politics and political compromise. They are all imperfect in their own ways, some of them more imperfect than others. The Federal Reserve System, for example, is somewhat strange in that originally it was designed to be a decentralized central bank. And by that I mean there are actually 12 Federal Reserve banks in different cities across the United States. And the original idea was that they would sort of be regional central banks, each including a number of states. What happened over time, and reasons we'll talk about in a little bit, the center of the system in Washington, D.C. gained more power and really turned it into a much more centralized central bank. It's also important to understand, right, that the reason we have the central bank is that one, political compromise, but two, people misunderstood and misdiagnosed problems with the previous system. It's interesting that the U.S. central bank is called the Federal Reserve System. That seems like a strange name. Why isn't it the Bank of the U.S.? Like, well, that the notion of reserve in the Federal Reserve System has to do with the belief people had that the problem with the previous system, the way in which those reserves were sort of pyramided with the New York banks at the top or at the bottom, whichever way you want to look at it. And so they thought the problem was if we could only centrally control reserves, we could make sure that banks always had enough money when people needed currency. But that, I think, was a wrong diagnosis of the problem. The problem wasn't the reserve system was a problem. The main problem were the regulations that prevented banks from issuing currency the way they issued deposits. And that's one of the key features of a free banking system we'll talk about in a little bit, is that currency and deposits are basically issued the same way and based on the same kinds of assets. But the people at the time misunderstood that, I think. And so between that, the political incentive of the central bank, we ended up with the Federal Reserve System. So how has the Federal Reserve System done? How have central banks done in the time that we've had them? One way of thinking about this is to say, how does the Federal Reserve System compare to the U.S. economy before the Fed? And I pointed out, before the Fed, there were a number of financial panics. There were problems. That system was not great. But despite all that, it turns out that the period before the Federal Reserve of the United States was much more stable macroeconomically than after the Federal Reserve. So one of the things we see in the 19th century in the United States is that the price level was fairly stable. In fact, it slowly fell over the course of the late 19th century. And that's what you want to see happen in a growing progressive economy. You want to see prices slowly decline over time. So despite the financial panics we did not see during the 1800s in the United States, about inflation, there were a few small recessions, but nothing like what we've seen in the 20th century. And one of the best papers to read on this, and I think I made it available in my PowerPoint, a full citation, is a paper called "Has the Fed Been a Failure?" That's in the Journal of Macroeconomics. I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, by George Selgin, Larry White, and a gentleman named Bill Lestraps. And that paper, "Has the Fed Been a Failure?" really goes through this evidence in a great amount of detail. One of the things they point out in the paper is that a basket of consumer goods, of things that households might buy, that would have cost $100 in 1790, cost about $108, so a little bit more, in 1913. But thereafter, and by the price of that sort of nominal price that went up, and by 2008, that same basket in nominal terms would cost over $2,000. And that gives you a sense of the inflation that we've seen happen since the origins of the Fed. The other thing that we can see since in the 105 years since the Fed is about a severe bout of deflation in the Great Depression. That in a second, and much more volatility, much more variance in output and employment, much less stability there than we saw before the Fed. So at least on a first look, the Fed perhaps hasn't done the job that we hoped it would do, and has in fact made matters worse. Let me talk about a few details here. Right. The Fed was created in 1913, and almost immediately after that, the United States found itself in World War I. And during that war, not surprisingly, the Fed engaged in some significant inflation. Again, one of the reasons governments like central banks is that they can use central banks to pay for government activities, especially and including war. So there was a significant inflation in the United States in the 1910s, and that was followed by a recession in 1920-21. And remember, the Fed was created to prevent exactly this sort of thing from happening. Yet, within the first 10 years of the Fed being in existence, we saw what looks like an inflationary boom and then a recessionary bust. Not long after that, of course, comes the 1920s, and this is the most famous boom and bust of them all. And the evidence is pretty clear that the Fed contributed to the boom of the 1920s, to the artificial boom, the unsustainable boom. The Austrian economists have talked about this, but others have too. That inflation in the 1920s led to a downturn, a recession in 1929, eventually led to the stock market crash, and then we found ourselves at the start of the Great Depression. Now, economic historians argue that at that point, if the Fed had done nothing and let the recession cure itself, we probably would have had a recession much like the one in 1920, 1921. But the Fed made another error starting in 1930 and put the brakes on, tried to stop the economy too hard. And from 1930 to 1933, the Fed allowed the money supply in the United States to decline by 30%. And that drop in the money supply turned what probably would have been a recession into what we know as the Great Depression. There were other factors that made matters worse at the time, and we can talk about the Great Depression in the question and answer if you want. But certainly, almost everyone agrees that the 30% drop in the money supply the Fed allowed to happen turned a recession into a depression, made matters much, much worse. And again, this is exactly the sort of thing the Fed was created to prevent from happening. The Fed's job was to not let these kinds of things happen. And here again, in 20 years after it opened doors, it was significantly responsible for the worst depression in the history of the United States, and certainly in the history of the world. The other point to note here is, how did the Fed respond to this problem? Right? Was it held responsible for what was causing problems? And the answer is no. In fact, what the Fed argued was the reason it couldn't prevent it or didn't do the things it needed to do and couldn't get things right was that it didn't have enough power. And so in the mid-1930s, 1934, 1935, the United States passed several new laws that actually gave the Fed more power. And in particular, it was at this point that the powers of the Fed went to its office in Washington and away from those 12 district banks around the country. So really, it's after the Great Depression, 1935, during the Great Depression, that the Fed becomes a truly central bank in this way. Also worth noting, this very same period, 1934-35, is when Canada created a central bank as well. So what happens with this more powerful Fed? Well, we see since World War II in the United States a great deal of instability. Since World War II, we've had inflation rates in the United States that are higher than ever. At no point really in the history of the United States have we seen inflation rates like we have in the last 7 years. We've also seen a number of recessions since World War II, major ones in 1973, 74, and 1981, 82, and of course then in 2007, 8, 9, what we call the Great Recession. Once again, these are the problems that central banks were supposed to have stopped us from happening. The job of central banks is to prevent these sorts of things. It's interesting that we now tend to think of the central bank having the job of coming in and fixing these problems once they've happened, as if they bear no blame for them happening in the first place. And sometimes I like to talk about that. That central banks are like a guy who comes in and starts a building on fire, right? Sets a building on fire, and then comes around the other side dressed up as a firefighter, with and tries to say, "Look at me, I'm the hero. I'm putting the fire out." Right? But wait, you started the fire in the first place, right? And so one of the problems that that we don't understand well enough about central banks is that even though they portray themselves as being the ones to solve these problems, and they often don't, they make them worse, in reality, they're often causing these problems. And if you look, for example, at the financial crisis and the Great Recession, the last decade in the United States, a couple of points we're making. One of them is that the Fed bears significant responsibility for that recession. There was inflation after 9/11, after 2001. And then once the bust began to happen in 2007 and 2008, the Fed overreacted the other way and set us up for worse inflation in the future. The Fed, during that 2008, 2009 period, also basically said, we don't have enough powers, once again, same thing they said in the Great Depression, and has grabbed a whole bunch of new powers left and right. We've seen bailouts. We've seen a lack of transparency. We've seen the Fed much more involved in the allocation of capital and capital markets. And you can understand why in the United States there was a strong reaction a few years back, a strong reaction against the banks. It's not still there as strong as it used to be, but certainly you can see why this would upset people, that you have this institution that many perceive to be undemocratic, sort of grabbing all of these new powers in crisis, especially when, again, the Fed bears significant blame for causing the problem in the first place. So the Fed's record since its creation is not really very good. We've seen the Great Depression, the Great Recession, other recessions. We've seen inflation, instability in output and prices. So even just sort of looked at alone, it's not clear that the Fed has done a very good job. And when we compare that again to the era before the Fed, even with its problems, that one was much more stable macroeconomically. So one question we might then talk about is, why do central banks have these problems? Why do central banks continue to fail in these ways? Do we use an economic theory that can help us understand that? And I think, from my perspective, what we here understand is that the Fed, that central banks, are no different than other kinds of attempts by government to regulate and plan economy. They face the same problems that face planners and regulators elsewhere. So let's start with just an assumption to help understand this point. Let's assume that what the central bank is trying to do is to create the quantity of money that the public wants to hold, right? You can think about supply and demand here. That the central bank's job is to supply just the quantity of money that the public wants to hold. And it's important to understand that when we talk about the demand for money, we're talking about the money that people hold in their wallets or in their bank accounts. You demand money when you hold it. When you spend money, you're actually lowering your demand for money because you're holding less money. This is important to understand when we think about macroeconomics. So if we imagine that that is the job of the banking system, and that's what central banks are trying to do. And we can think of it in the same way that people who sell shoes want to produce and sell the amount of shoes that people want to buy, right? In this sense, money, the production of money is like the production of any other good. So if we take that as the goal, what we want the banking system to do is to adjust the quantity of money that it creates, that it supplies to what the public holds. We can start to ask some questions. First one is, how does a central bank know exactly how much money people want to hold? How does the central bank know what that demand for money is? What central banks, in fact, try to do is to collect all kinds of data and sort of figure out what's going on in the economy. But the reality is that data is not going to help them all that much, when the reasons, the decisions people make about how much money to hold might well be a couple of things about those decisions. One of them is that's an awful lot of knowledge to accumulate, right? You'd have to gather all kinds of information from everyone in the economy about how much money they think they want to hold. That's one problem. A second problem is, by the time you gathered that information and processed it, it would likely be out of date. But a third, and I think more fundamental problem, that some of the knowledge that people rely on when they make economic decisions is not knowledge that they can express instantly. statistics or in words. It's not data that can be collected by a central bank or really by any government agency. This is one of the points that the Austrian economists like Mises and Hayek made in the debate over socialism in the 1930s and 40s. In particular, Hayek pointed out some of the knowledge, perhaps much of the knowledge that matters in an economy is tacit, it's inarticulate, it's of a nature that we can't put in words and numbers very easily. We know things, but we can't explain them well to other people. So, for example, if you're able to ride a bicycle, you can solve some very complicated physics equations to keep yourself balanced riding a bicycle. But if someone else asks you, how do you keep your balance on a bicycle? It's hard to explain to them exactly what it is that you're doing when you ride a bike, yet you know how to do it. It might be that a good deal of the knowledge that matters in the economy is tacit in this way. So the problem facing central banks is how do they collect all that knowledge together and then use it to figure out how much money to spend? If they can't collect that knowledge, or if by the time they try to collect it, it's out of date, you can see why they would make mistakes about how much money they should be producing. So one set of problems central banks face are the same sets of problems that attempts at socialist planning, or even that smaller scale planning or regulation by governments face, which they have to collect all of this knowledge, and often that knowledge is not of a form that can be easily collected and centralized. A second set of problems that central banks face are what we might call public choice problems. And public choice economics, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is using the tools of economics to study how political institutions operate. And the key assumption that public choice economics makes is that when people are involved in political institutions, whether it's politicians or bureaucrats or central bankers, we assume that they are generally self-interested in the same way that people are when they interact in the marketplace. So one of the questions we might ask about central banks is, do central bankers have an incentive? Is it in their self-interest to actually produce the quantity of money that people wish to hold? That is, do they have an incentive to head towards what we call monetary equilibrium? Or are the incentives facing central bankers something else, right? To do something else. And as I suggested before, right, there are a lot of reasons why central bankers have it in their self-interest to generate inflation. When central banks create inflation, when governments create inflation, it gives them resources to spend. It reduces the real value of their debts, and governments are usually the biggest debtors in any economy. And so from the government's perspective, creating inflation, from the perspective of politicians, creating inflation enables them to spend money and do things that get them votes. Even for the central bankers themselves, right, doing things that please politicians is a good thing. What this helps us understand is why mistakes that central banks seem to make are almost always mistakes that cause inflation rather than deflation. You might think that if the mistakes central banks made were just knowledge mistakes, right, that they were just because they didn't have enough information, we should see a kind of random distribution. Sometimes they'll create too much, sometimes they'll create too little. But it turns out almost always, with a few exceptions, central banks inflate, they create too much. And so that seems to require an explanation of something in addition to the knowledge problems I pointed out before. And these public choice problems, the problem of political incentives, can help us to understand why it is that central banks tend to make mistakes on the side of inflation more than deflation. In this way, central bankers are just like other politicians, right? The fact that the people running the Federal Reserve System, whether it's Greenspan or Bernanke or Yellen, that all of these folks, even if they have PhDs in economics, right? One, they still can't acquire all the knowledge they need, and secondly, they still face the same incentive to politicians, no matter how smart or how well-intentioned they may be. These are what we might call structural problems facing central bankers. And then if we add one more piece to this puzzle, and those of you who have studied some economics will be familiar with the idea of policy lags, right? The idea that when we try to make monetary or fiscal policy, we face these various lags. I like to think of these lags as coming in 5 stages. First, let's talk in terms of central banks. Central bank has to recognize that there's some sort of problem it needs to solve. Secondly, it has to collect data on that problem. Third, once it has the data, it has to take time to make a decision about what to do about it. Fourth, it has to actually implement that decision. That is, the other people in the central bank to actually do what it's decided to do. And then last, it takes time for that decision to be effective. So between recognizing there's a problem, collecting the data, deciding what to do, implementing that decision, and then the time it takes for that decision to have an effect will mean that by the time the central bank actions are having an effect on the economy, it could be, as Milton Friedman said, a year, 18 months, much later than the actual problem. It could be by the time that the solution to the problem actually comes, the problem has disappeared, or perhaps we have the opposite problem, and the solution makes matters worse. So one of the ways in which central banks face this real problems is that they face this lag, and that even if they recognize there's a problem they should try to address, by the time they're actually able to address it, it might be too late. One of the ways we can think about this is that central banks are looking for a lot. Think about losing an earring in a dark room. And central banks are sort of like crawling around on the floor in a dark room looking for that earring. It's very difficult to find. At some point, you're going to say, I keep, banging my head into the furniture. I keep falling on things. It's just not worth looking for the ring anymore. And in a way, one of the arguments that people make for binding central banks to something like a monetary rule is simply saying we should stop trying to give banks the power to look around and solve these problems, because every time they solve them, they seem to make matters worse. And you can see why some monetarists would say, people like Freeman said, the central bank should just have a fixed rule for how much it grows the money supply every year. That way it won't keep making any mistakes. The problem with that argument, though, is when you do that, you're sort of giving up. You're giving up trying to reach monetary equilibrium. You're giving up trying to find that earring you dropped. My question is there a way that we can turn the light on? Is there a way that we can actually see and sort of have a system that enables us to find monetary equilibrium without banging into the furniture all the time? And that, to me, is where the free banking alternative comes in. Are there better ways than a central bank to avoid inflation and deflation? And I think a free banking system would do that. So let me take I've got about 10 minutes left, and I'll take about 7 of those minutes to talk about free banking. And then I want to say a few words about transitioning to free banking. What does a free banking system look like? In a free banking system, banks are regulated just like every other business. There's no special regulation for banks. So, for example, banks can issue both deposits, the way they do now, checking accounts, but also currency as their own liabilities. We're so used to thinking about paper money being created by governments that we've lost this idea that for most of the history of banking, banks created their own paper money. You held paper money in the United States in 1884. You were holding something that was a liability of an individual bank, not the government. People want to use paper money still, and so banks in a free banking system, individual banks create their own currency and compete to offer currency that they thought was better than their competitors. Both currency and deposits, though, would have to be redeemable in some sort of outside money. Some people who argue for free banking would like that to be gold. I'm sympathetic to that argument. It doesn't have to be gold. There's other things that conceivably work. But the key is that why would people accept paper money or accept the liabilities, the deposit liabilities of a bank, if they couldn't redeem it, couldn't exchange it for something that has value outside of the banking system, such as gold? So in a free banking system, banks would create their own currency and their own deposits. Those would be redeemable ultimately, if people wanted, redeemable in gold. A free banking system would have fractional reserves. Banks would hold a percentage of their obligations as gold, as deposits at other banks or at clearinghouses. Historically, fractional reserve banking systems have been just fine as long as they've been competitive in this way. Canada was fractional reserves. The Scottish banking system of the late 18th and early 19th century was fractional reserve. Banks there operated at about 2% reserves. Bank failures were very unusual, and inflation was more or less non-existent. We can talk about, if you're interested in this question some more, we can talk about it more in the question and answer. But the basic idea is government treats the system no different than other markets. Enforce the contracts that people make. Let banks operate nationwide. So just because a bank is headquartered in one city, it should be able to operate anywhere else within the country. Let banks decide on what they think the appropriate level of reserves to hold is, and decide what sort of loans they can make and so forth. So what you would have here is a competitive banking system. The key to this is that this would encourage and enable banks to supply the amount of money that people wish to hold. It will enable them to come close anyway to monetary equilibrium. It turns out that the profit maximizing point for competitive banks is to do just that, to supply what their customers want to hold. If free banks create too much money, people take that money and they spend it, and the money eventually goes back to the bank that issued it, and it has to give up reserves to other banks. And if a bank sees its reserves being drained away like that, that's going to be a concern, and banks will want to stop that from happening, and so they have an incentive to reduce the amount of money that they're creating. On the other hand, if banks create too few loans, if they don't create enough money, right? If they push towards deflation, they're sacrificing the interest they can earn by making more loans. And free banks that don't create enough money will see their reserves piling up, and will see a loss of income from the loans that they could be making. And so when you look at the bank's decision between risking not having enough money and risking the loss of interest from creating too little, right? There's a point right in between those, a profit maximizing point, where they produce exactly the amount of money that the public wishes to. Systems, as I said, systems that work like this have existed historically in Scotland, in Canada, and other places. In general, the results were very good, very few bank failures. One of the things I should point out about the Canadian system is that in the 1920s and 1930s, when over 8,000 banks failed during the Great Depression, the total number of Canadian banks that failed during the Great Depression is in fact zero. One Canadian bank failed in the 1920s and was quickly dealt with. No Canadian bank failed during the Great Depression. Some banks closed branches, none of them failed. So the bottom line here is that a free banking system, a competitive system of money production, can do a better job at achieving monetary equilibrium, of avoiding deflation, of avoiding business cycles, and of avoiding recessions and depressions than can central banks. So the last question to address today is, how might we get to this kind of system, right? As I said before, that's a real challenge, because central bankers and governments don't want to give up their power. They don't want to relinquish their ability to create money and reduce debts and resources to spend. So I can think of three reasons to be somewhat optimistic, or three elements of a path toward a free banking system. One of the things that we're seeing in a few countries right now is that central banks are reducing the reserve requirements on banks. They're allowing banks to set their own reserve requirements. Canada's done this, New Zealand's done this, I think a couple others as well. And that enables banks to get used to this idea that it's their responsibility to decide how many reserves to hold. It does give the central bank a little bit less leverage over monetary policy, and it gives banks a little bit more freedom. And this suggests that perhaps are some ways that central banks can be convinced to give their powers. And it's possible we might see sort of competitive pressure on central banks to do this. The countries who have made this move do better. But I think the second and third things are important. One of the things that's true worldwide, of course, is that there's been a decline in the use of paper currency, right? Paper money. That people simply don't use as much paper money as they do anymore. I joke, my wife never has actual dollars in her purse anymore, right? Because we use our debit cards or our phones, or whatever it might be, right? We directly access our checking account dollars. We don't spend cash very often. I think this is important, right? This weakens the importance of cash in the economy, and that's one of the central bank's biggest assets. And it also means that people are getting used to thinking of their money in terms of checking account dollars. And in fact, we have a system right now in the United States anyway, where banks compete to offer checking account dollars. We don't think about it this way. But your checking account money is private money, more or less, in the sense that it's a liability of that individual bank. And the more that we rely on checking account dollars as opposed to currency, the more that things start to look like a more competitive free banking system. The third thing, I think, is the most important. And I know that the next talk is going to be talking about cryptocurrency, but I think cryptocurrencies are really important. I'm somewhat of a skeptic of crypto in the sense that I don't think that cryptocurrencies can ever replace money as we know it. But they do perform a really important role, which is they offer people an alternative to central bank created money. And they help us understand that money doesn't have to be created by a central bank. And I think to the degree that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin catch on, that the more people use them, the more people will think, well, perhaps we don't really need that central bank anymore. And you can think about this as being analogous to the way that Uber and Lyft need people to think that we don't need to have taxi cabs anymore, right? We have these alternatives, right? Or that Airbnb means we don't need the typical hotels anymore. We have alternatives that may work better, right? And lead us to be skeptical about central banks. So I think, what we might see is slow abandonment of central banks as people begin to adopt cryptocurrencies, perhaps other alternatives to money that we haven't even thought about. I think one of the advantages of cryptocurrency and this way of thinking about things is it doesn't, if these alternatives are effective, it doesn't require government sort of collapsing or getting rid of its central banks. Those central banks should sort of fade away after a while as people begin to use different things. So for me, if there's a path toward free banking away from central banks, cryptocurrencies are going to be a big part of that. So again, I think in the end, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies can't replace traditional money. I'd much rather see, and I think much more effective would be something like a free banking system. So I think I will leave it there. The closing message I will give to you is central banks are a problem, and I think it's really important for people who are concerned with the health of economies and with the freedom of economies to make the case against central banking. We have to be very careful to make that case based on good theory, good history, and make arguments that really are based both in theory and history, so that we make the best possible arguments we can for a free banking system. So thank you all very much, and I guess there's some time for questions. So thank you.
Okay. Bởi vì nói này nó không nói được trực tiếp ở đây, nên chắc là xin phép các bạn tôi vài câu ở đây để câu hỏi đó. Tôi xin lại các bạn. Okay. Professor Horwitz.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Mings. It's my honor to be here with you, and thank you very much for the lectures. It's very interesting and impressive. I just have some just few quick questions for the presentation. The first one is on as you know, the strong argument for central bank is that yes, it's my good if we have some inflation. High inflation is not good, but deflation is really terrible. And central bank's argument is that it may control the monetary supplies, so we may keep inflation at a little bit high rate, and that's some rate, so it's good for the economic growth. So how about the response on that argument?
Yeah, so two things I would say to that argument. First of all, I think that oftentimes economists and central bankers underestimate the cost of inflation, right? They think that a small amount of inflation is a price worth paying to avoid deflation, which is pretty much what you said. But I think that even small amounts of inflation over time can easily become a much bigger problem. And certainly we know from history that inflationary booms have turned into recessions and depressions very often. And so I think avoiding inflation is also important. The other thing I'd say about deflation is, central banks haven't been so great always about avoiding deflation. The Great Depression example in the United States is one of the best examples of that. And I think it's also important to distinguish between two different understandings of deflation. There's the deflation that happens when we allow the money supply to drop, like we saw in the Great Depression. But we also see deflation. If by deflation we just mean falling prices, we can see prices falling as a result of healthy economic growth. And in fact, if the banking system is doing its job in maintaining monetary equilibrium, what we should see is prices falling to the same degree that the productivity of the economy is rising. So as economies get more productive, stuff, goods and services should get cheaper. So that kind of deflation that comes sort of from the real goods and services side, not only is that not a problem, that's a really good thing. And one of the mistakes I think that central banks have made is that sometimes they've seen that good deflation and thought it was their job to prevent that from happening, and ended up expanding the money supply to stop that good deflation. And the result was that they created problems. And I think that's exactly what happened in the United States in the 1920s, where productivity was driving prices down, and that was a good thing. That's what should have happened. But central banks were worried about price stability, and they decided, the Fed in particular, decided to try to offset that with expansion, and that created the boom that triggered the bust that led to the Great Depression. So I'm not persuaded that when central bankers say we need a little bit of inflation to avoid deflation, that's really good. I think they're underestimating the problems with inflation and often misunderstanding that sometimes the deflation that comes from falling prices due to productivity is a good thing. I'd also wonder whether central banks, as I said toward the end, would be capable of recognizing the problems and responding to them effectively. But thank you. That is a good question, and it's exactly the kind of question that many economists would ask.
Có câu hỏi nào muốn hỏi bởi vì sau này đây là ông không nghe được thì đúng định mình nó không có một cái nên rất là liệt nên có thể là cái này như là
đây chỉ âm đúng không? Nó không cần phải Hello,
Hello.
Dr. Horwitz. Yeah, I'm here. I'm a tech guy. I work in technical. I am a beginner in like blockchain area. So I have two questions with you. The first question is India. I don't know what exactly happened in your country, like American, but in Vietnam, it's so a little bit. I think have some different between American finance and Vietnam financial and economy. So someone in Vietnam, I remember Dr. Mr. Alan Phan. He said that in a, with Vietnam case, when some like some bank some banks ngân hàng tư nhân cổ phần này em có nói gì? Tức là some bank in Vietnam will fail and they can go on in the economy. They cannot continue running. So the central bank in Vietnam save them by the way, like the central bank buy another bank and buy another bank with price and not just price like $0, $0 Vietnam dong. Yeah, it's so yeah, okay, and that is my first question. So the second question is about my area. I work in blockchain. So how do you think? What do you think about the blockchain and the effect of blockchain and cryptocurrency with the central bank and also economy and finance of country like Vietnam or American in your country? Did you get me?
Yes, I did. So I think the first question was something like, do we need central banks to be there when banks fail to prevent bank failures from causing all kinds of problems? I think a couple of things there. First of all, bank failures in general happen because, well, let's back up even one step. Banks fail because they make bad loans, right? If banks are making bad loans because the people running those banks aren't very good, we should want banks to fail, right? That's a good reason for banks to fail. Same reason why we want other businesses to fail if they're not pleasing consumers. On the other hand, if banks are making bad loans because government policy has created incentives for them to make bad loans or made it hard for them to make good loans, that's different. Then we want to change those policies. And I think historically, a lot of bank failures in many different countries have resulted from those bad policies. So the first thing we want to think about is, would there be, in a system without central banks, would there be as many bank failures in the first place? And I suspect there wouldn't. In systems with central banks, ideally, when banks fail, we'd like to have those banks go through the usual procedure that any other kind of company would when it fails. It needs to go through bankruptcy to pay off its debtors. If what we do every time a bank fails is have the central bank step in and buy it or bail it out, that we're just subsidizing those bad mistakes and those bad policies. We want to try to get banks out of the system making mistakes and get rid of policies that are causing them. The question on blockchain and crypto, I think blockchain is going to have tremendous importance. It already does in many ways for economies across the globe. I'm not an expert on blockchain, so I'm going to just say a couple of quick things. I think this is a technology, a way of thinking about technology that will enable firms to do some things that they haven't been able to do before. I think we'll see it spread out of the realm of cryptocurrencies and into, as we already are, into everyday commerce. And it has the potential for being part of a significant revolution in how we do business. Whether things like Bitcoin and cryptos can replace the dollar or other currencies, I think is a different question. What it may turn out to be the case that what the cryptocurrencies did was give us blockchain. It's blockchain that turns out to be the really important thing, and not the cryptocurrency. We'll see what happens in the next few years as these things all develop. But if I had to make a prediction, that'd be my prediction, that the cryptocurrencies aren't ever going to get much bigger than they are, more widely used than they are. The blockchain, the technology behind cryptocurrencies, is going to become really, really big. So that's my thoughts on that.
So thank you very much, Professor Horwitz. We just take you 1 hour, and I think that is now it's time for us to summarize the presentations and have some discussion on what you provide to us. And I hope that we have some more opportunities to discuss and exchange ideas on these very interesting topics.
Well, and I just want to thank you all again for having me. It is it's one of the amazing things about the 21st century that I can be sitting here at 8 o'clock in the morning giving a talk to a group of folks in Vietnam halfway around the world in the evening, and that has been a real pleasure. So thank you all for inviting me.
Okay. So thank you. So we stop now.